That's what the system said. So he has been removed automatically. If you don't want to be recorded in the meeting, the system removes you automatically. All right, so the recording is up now. I will share my screen and we'll move on. All right, let's start the cardio. So this is the anatomy, this is the physiology. This is where the anatomy ended. So this is where the physiology started. Now, there are two physiologies that are very tricky in the USMLE pathway. That is respiratory physiology and cardiophysiology. But in all honesty, of these two physiology, the respiratory physiology is the most tricky. That's like a no man's land. No matter how good you are, if they want to mess you up, they will give you a respiratory predominant question type. If you see a respiratory predominant question type in your exam, you just need to be praying, because that's an island they can definitely destroy you. Now, let us focus on the cardiophysio. The way I normally do my lectures most times is I like starting from the beginning. So there's a lot of things we didn't talk about from the cardiac anatomy. So we're starting from the middle, but I will still find a way to strike a balance. So let us look at stroke volume. I want you to understand first, what is stroke volume? Let's start from then. Now, when you talk about stroke volume is the quantity of blood that leaves the heart after every heartbeat. Let's say at the end of one heartbeat, at the end of contraction, 600 mils of blood left the heart. This 600 mils of blood is definitely what is called your stroke volume. Now, the things that are important for you to know, if you've understood the basic, that stroke volume is the quantity of blood that leaves the heart after each heartbeat. Now, let us advance it one step further to look at the three factors that definitely affect your stroke volume. Now, those three factors are contractility. The next one is preload. And the third one is afterload. A lot of people confuse these concepts a whole lot. Now, you have to understand what each of these concepts are. Now, when you talk about preload, let's start with preload. What is preload? Preload is the amount of blood that is returned back to the heart after diastole. See, the heart has two ways it works. This is the heart. The heart has two functions. The first function is that it receives blood from all parts of the body via the veins. The second function is that that blood it receives, it pumps it back to the arteries and sends it back to the body. So I get blood from the body, that is the function of the heart, and that blood, I pump it back to the body via the arteries. So when you talk about preload, preload is the total amount of blood that was returned back to the heart from different parts of the body via the veins. Now, the second thing is afterload. Afterload does not have to do with volume of blood. Afterload has to do with pressure. That is the first catch. Preload has to do with volume of blood. Afterload has to do with pressure. So afterload is the pressure the heart must overcome to pump out that blood from its cavities. Now, the heart is supposed to pump the blood into the arteries. Now, you should understand that fluid flow from region of higher pressure to that of lower pressure. That is the natural flow. Now, the pressure in the artery, especially the pressure in the aorta, is as high as 120. So what it means is that the heart must definitely overcome that pressure of 120 that is in the aorta before it can move its blood from the left ventricle to the aorta. So that pressure the heart is overcoming before the blood moves is what is called the afterload. Now, on the other hand, when you talk about contractility, contractility is the force at which the heart definitely contracts. Now, let's look at how these three parameters affect your stroke volume. Now, let's start from preload. There's a way the heart functions. The heart is garbage in, garbage out. What I receive is what I'm going to give. If I don't receive, I don't think I will give back. That is how the heart functions. You cannot give what you don't have. That is the truth. If the heart receives 500 mils of blood, the heart cannot give you 800 mils of blood. Where will it get the other 300 from? It is only what it receives it can give back. So that simply means that if the preload is increased, that is, if the blood that comes back to the heart is increased at the end of diastole, the heart has more than enough to give out. So automatically the heart has received a lot. It will also give a lot. So when preload goes up, stroke volume automatically goes up. And when your preload falls, your stroke volume falls. If the heart receives less, it gives less. So in a nutshell, we can say your preload is directly proportional to your stroke volume. So when preload goes up, stroke volume goes up. When preload falls, stroke volume falls. And you know why? Because I just explained it. Now, on the other hand, the afterload is inversely proportional to your stroke volume. Think about it. The more pressure the heart has to overcome to pump out blood, the lesser the blood that will definitely go out. The lower the pressure, the more blood it can push out. So if I increase the pressure at which the heart needs to pump out that blood, the heart can only pump out a lower amount of blood because the pressure is too high. It's struggling to handle that pressure. Just imagine if I definitely give you a task. I tell you to move 5 kg boxes. These boxes are weighing 5 kg. I'm guessing everybody in this meeting is an adult. So 5 kg box will not be so difficult for an adult to move. And I tell you, move these 5 kg boxes. There are about 20 of them. I want you to move them in about 30 minutes to 1 hour. Now, in 30 minutes to 1 hour, you'll be able to move almost all of these 5 kg boxes because they are not so heavy. The pressure is not so much. But now, come to think about it, if I increase the pressure of these boxes to like 30 kg, and I ask you to do the same thing, move 20 of these 30 kg boxes in 30 minutes to 1 hour, the chances is very high that at the end of 30 minutes, you'd have only moved like 4 or 5 of it. That is the same thing that happens in the heart. Once you take up the pressure, that is the afterload, the pressure in the vessels, the heart finds it difficult to move out the blood because it is now challenging. Doing this thing against high pressure is hard. The same way you moving the 30 kg box is hard. But when you drop the pressure, automatically the stroke volume goes up. So afterload is inversely proportional to stroke volume. They go in opposite direction. Now, on the other hand, when you talk about contractility, contractility is also directly proportional to your stroke volume. Now, I want you to think about this. For those of you who are Nigerians, you know what they call catapults. For those of you who are American or English people, I think they call it sling, if I'm not mistaken. So I'm going to draw the local one. Sling is what David used to kill Goliath normally. Okay, no, let me use an arrow. I think everybody can relate to its arrow, since this is um, a general class. Now, when you want to shoot an arrow, there is a bow, and you have your arrow. This is the arrow. This is the bow. Now, you can agree with me that the extent you draw the bow will determine how far the arrow will go. If you draw the bow small, the arrow will just move a little bit and fall. If you draw the bow maximally, the arrow moves with a lot of pressure. It can go very far. That is the same thing with contractility. Once the contractility is small, the stroke volume will be small. Once the contractility is big, the stroke volume increases. So when contractility goes up, stroke volume goes up. When contractility drops, stroke volume also comes down. We'll play with this a whole lot as we progress. That's the first thing we're establishing. That is the stroke volume. Now, let us move to the contractility. There's a lot of things we can play with in contractility. Each of these points that is listed here has a lot of meanings to it. You need to understand what it is. You don't need to cram. I don't like people cramming. I like people understanding, except there is no way to understand. You can memorize. But all of these points has explanations that you can understand and you don't cram. Now, when you look at contractility, when you talk about contractility, contractility, like we said, is directly proportional to stroke volume. So they go hand in hand. Now, let us look at things that increases contractility and things that decreases contractility. First of all, they said catecholamine stimulation via beta 1 receptor. Now, we're going to look at two things concerning this. We're going to look at two things concerning this. Now, when you look at your catecholamines, what are your catecholamines? Your non-epinephrine is a catecholamine. Your epinephrine is a catecholamine. Now, what does catecholamine do at the level of the beta 1 receptor? They are expecting before you got to cardiology, you would have done general pharmacology. Now, there's what we call the beta receptors. There is the beta 1, there is the beta 2. The beta 1 receptors are those ones that are found in the heart muscles, basically. Now, what does beta 1 receptor does? Beta 1 receptors are responsible for causing increased contractility and increase in heart rate. So this is what they do. They increase the heart rate, number one. They also increase contractility. So these two things, they increase it. Now, see what you need to understand. This is where it gets tricky. That is the first point they were explaining. Now, when you look at the beta 1 receptor, the beta 1 receptor goes via a second messenger system that is called your GS protein, which is the CNAP pathway. See what you need to understand. I'm not bringing you to general pharmacology because we haven't done that. I need to tie in that to bring you to speed. Now, this is your cell. Let's say this is the cardiac cell. The only thing that is permitted to cross this cardiac cell is anything that is lipid soluble. For example, these are your lipid soluble hormones or lipid soluble drug. They can cross the phospholipid bilayer of the cell membrane. But come to think about it, what of if this thing is not lipid soluble? Like if it is a protein, what do you think will happen? Automatically, it cannot go across this phospholipid bilayer. Now, your neurotransmitters are not lipid soluble. Your neurotransmitters cannot go across the cell membrane. They have to act at the level of the cell membrane. So this is where you have the second messenger system. Now think about it. This neurotransmitter in red, it wants to affect this particular structure in green inside of the cell. But the problem now is that it is not lipid soluble. It cannot come inside of this cell. So what it will do is that it will use what we call the second messenger pathway. Now, what will happen is this. There will be a receptor on the surface of this cell where this your neurotransmitter can bind. Now, when it binds to that receptor, there will be what we call a second messenger that is coupled to this receptor. So you will have this second messenger that is coupled to this receptor here. Now, what it simply means is that this receptor acts as a middleman between the neurotransmitter and the second messenger. So once the neurotransmitter binds to this receptor, it transfers the information to the receptor. The receptor automatically transfers it to this middleman, which is already inside of the cell. And the middleman will now carry that information to affect this structure. Now, you can classically see that the neurotransmitter did not enter into the cell, but it is able to create a biological response by affecting the structure that was inside of the cell. That is the second messenger pathway. Now, when you look at your beta 1 receptor, your beta 1 receptor is coupled to the GS protein, which goes via the CMAP pathway. I'm not going to talk about that. That is not what I'm interested in this class, but I'm just trying to bring you to speed. Now, what that simply means is that they will go via production of CNAP, and the end product of that CNAP pathway is activation of protein kinase. So let's assume this green here is the protein kinase. That is what your catecholamines wants to activate at the level of the beta 1 receptor. Once your protein kinase A is activated, it can carry out the effect of the catecholamines on the beta 1 receptor. Now, look at what catecholamine does on beta 1 receptor. It increases contractility and it also increases heart rate. So the first thing it will do now is to increase contractility. How will it increase contractility? It will cause calcium to increase in this cell. Calcium will quickly accumulate in this cell. Now, how will calcium accumulate? There's what we call the sarcoplasmic reticulum. This is the sarcoplasmic reticulum. The sarcoplasmic reticulum has calcium stored inside of it. So once protein kinase A has been activated, it will quickly cause SACA to release, it will cause sarcoplasmic reticulum rather to release their calcium. So you can see that calcium concentration goes up. Now, when this calcium concentration goes up, this will also cause extra calcium channel to open, and that will also cause more calcium to come in. So once you have a lot of calcium inside of the cell, contractility goes up because calcium mediates contractility. So this is how your catecholamine will increase contractility. Now, the second thing you need to observe is this. If you look at heart rate simply means one heartbeat. One heartbeat means one episode of contraction, one episode of relaxation. That is what makes a heartbeat. When they say your heart is beating fast or you have a high heart rate, it does not mean that it is only contraction that is happening. No, one heart rate is made up of diastole and systole. That is what consists of one heartbeat. The heart relaxes, it contracts. One beat, it relaxes, it contracts. Now, beta 1 is trying to increase contractility, and at the same time, it is also trying to increase heart rate. So it simply means that it has to do this contraction rapidly and quickly relax the heart. So how will it relax this heart? As long as calcium is high, you cannot relax the heart. So you have to take away the calcium. Immediately you bring the calcium and achieve contraction, you quickly have to take it out. Now, the way it will take it out is by phosphorylating phospholambda. That's what we call the phospholambda. Now, for those of you who did biochemistry with me in the free class, we said a kinase is an enzyme that has a phosphate molecule to another substance. So protein kinase A is a kinase. It has the ability to phosphorylate phospholambda. Now, once it has phosphorylated phospholambda, the job of phospholambda is to activate what we call the calcium ATPase. Now, the job of the calcium ATPase is to carry this calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. If this calcium moves back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, of course, the contraction will die down and the heart will relax. So the job of the protein kinase A now is that it does these two opposing things rapidly. First of all, it will quickly trigger the sarcoplasmic reticulum to push out the calcium. The heart will contract rapidly. It will quickly phosphorylate phospholambda to quickly activate calcium ATPase, take back the calcium again. The heart relaxes, and it does it in rapid sequence. That is how it's able to increase the contractility and as well as the heart rate. That is what is being explained in this particular first point. Now, the second thing you need to know, once intracellular calcium goes up, automatically contraction will go up. This we have already explained. Calcium is responsible for contractility. So once you increase it, automatically, you're definitely going to get increased heart rate. Now, see where the challenge lies. And this is where you need the understanding. Why is it that intracellular, if you reduce extracellular sodium, you're definitely going to have increased contractility? How is it possible? That does not make sense. Does it make sense? Yeah, it does make a whole lot of sense if you have the information. Now, see what you need to understand. This is the heart. Sodium is on the outside. Sodium is abundant on the extracellular fluid. Now, calcium is on the inside here. There's a particular transporter that is called the sodium calcium exchange transporter. Now, this is an antipod. An antipod means they are going opposite direction. Co-transporter means they are going in the same direction. So this is antipod, meaning sodium is going to leave from the extracellular to the intracellular. So this is the normal movement. Sodium leaves from the extracellular to the intracellular. On the other hand, calcium leaves from the intracellular to the extracellular. So what this transporter does is that it reduces the calcium inside of the cell. So it reduces contractility. Now think about it. When sodium gets low in the extracellular space, the body like to compensate. What the body will do is to tell this particular transporter, I cannot be giving you sodium. Sodium is already low in the extracellular space. So I want to hold on to my sodium. I don't want this guy to have hyponatremia and have seizures from it, has cerebral edema. So the heart, I am not giving you sodium anymore. Hold your calcium, let me hold my sodium. Because the body is looking for how to raise the serum sodium. So automatically, this transporter will become inhibited. If this transporter is inhibited because of this low extracellular sodium, automatically this calcium inside of the cell will definitely accumulate. Contraction goes up. The more the calcium, the more the contractility. That is what that concept was trying to explain. On the other hand, now, if we look at that medication, detoxin, a lot of you know that digoxin is an inotropic medication. When you talk of inotrope increases contractility. Now, if a patient has heart failure, you give digoxin, contractility goes up. But have you ever asked yourself, how will contractility go up? How will this happen? I like asking a lot of how and why, because I'm somebody who likes to understand. I don't like to cram. Yeah, you can look at the literature and just pick it up and say, oh, the digoxin increases cardiac contractility. Yeah, you crammed it. If they now decide to move one step further, you meet a clinical vignette and they decide to test the depth of your knowledge, you discover that you don't even know anything on that concept. Because cramming in this pathway will definitely not save you. Understanding is what will definitely save you on the due day. Now, let's look at the digoxin. If we talk about the digoxin has an interplay between two concepts. So let's start with the first one. The first one is there's a particular transporter you have on the cell. It is also an antipod or antipod transporter, meaning two things goes in opposite direction. Now let us assume this is sodium inside of the cell. This is sodium that is inside of the cell. This sodium, this particular transporter is called the sodium potassium ATPase transporter. Now, see what this transporter does. It takes sodium from inside of the cell down to the exterior. Why it takes potassium from the exterior down to inside of the cell. This is why it is an anti-transporter. So look at what it does. It takes sodium from inside to outside, and it takes potassium from outside to inside. Now, when you give a patient digoxin, this is what the digoxin does. The digoxin will come here and inhibit this transporter. That's what the digoxin does. It will come here and inhibit the transporter. Now, when the digoxin has inhibited this particular transporter, what do you think the net effect will be? Sodium will not accumulate inside of the cell because sodium is not going out again. Now, look at that transporter we talked about in the previous page. That sodium calcium transporter. Remember, this transporter takes calcium away. It takes calcium away from the cell. Why it brings in sodium into this cell? Now, the body tries to regulate everything at normal concentration. It doesn't want it to go so high. It doesn't want it to go so low. It tries to regulate it in a normal fashion. Now, because you have the digoxin has inhibited this sodium potassium ATPase transporter, and you have sodium accumulating, automatically the body will also want to shut down this transporter. This is not the digoxin doing this now, but the body wants to shut this down. Why does the body want to shut this down? The reason is simple. Sodium has accumulated because of the digoxin effect on the sodium potassium ATPase. So I don't need to be bringing more sodium into this cell. If I keep bringing more sodium into this cell, I will cause problem because the sodium will so accumulate in the cell. What I will follow it, this cell will swallow up and the cell will get busted. So automatically, this other calcium sodium transporter will be shut down. Now, when you shut down the calcium sodium transporter, of course, it will cause calcium to now accumulate inside of the cell. Once calcium accumulates, contraction happens. This is how the digoxin increases cardiac contractility. That is why it is an inotropic medication. This is how you need to understand it. Now, when you look at the things that reduces contractility, just think of the opposite of what I have said. If beta 1 stimulation increases contractility, the blockade will definitely decrease contractility. A patient that has heart failure, a patient with heart failure will definitely have reduced contractility, as simple as that, because the patient cannot be contracting well. Acidosis, hypoxia can also cause that. Then, when you look at the non-dihydropyridine calcium channel blocker, they block calcium from the heart. That can also cause reduction in contractility. Now, let us look at the preload. Remember, when you talk about preload, you're looking at volume, not pressure. This is the volume of blood that gets back to the heart at the end of diastole. Now, there are two things that will definitely affect your preload. Let us start talking about it. Now, the first thing I want to ask you is, what are the vessels that are responsible for bringing blood back to the heart? Those are the veins. The heart works in a dynamic way. The heart receives blood from every part of the body through the veins, and the heart pumps this blood back to every part of the body through the arteries. So receiving of blood is mediated by the veins. So of course, the veins are the major player in venous return, which is the same thing as preload. Now, what I need you to understand is that the veins are capacitant vessels. What that means is that the veins are storage vessels. These are the veins. Now, let's use blue for the veins. I like using blue for veins and red for arteries. I don't know, maybe that's just a stereotype behavior I have. Looking at anatomy atlas those days, veins were always represented in blue. Okay, now see, This particular vein is a capacitance vessel. Now, what it simply means is that the vein cannot give all the blood it has to the heart. It's not possible. That will cause the veins to collapse. At every point in time, put a needle in your vein. There is always blood in your veins. If you want to definitely take blood from a patient now, it's venous puncture you do. You put the syringe in the vein and draw blood. It simply means that at every point in time, the vein holds blood. So the vein is a capacitant vessel, is like a storage vessel. Now, this is where this thing gets important. The amount of blood that is returned back to the heart will be dependent on the amount of blood the vein is willing to give. Now, this is the normal size of this vein. Let's say about 3,000 mils of blood is passing through these veins. Of these 3,000, this vein is going to give the heart 2,000. This is just an illustration. It's going to give the heart 2,000 and it's going to hold 1,000 to itself at the level of this size. Now, the vein can undergo two different processes. The first one is that the vein can dilate. Look at this vein now. This dotted line in black is this vein dilating. If the vein dilates, of course, the vein can now hold more blood because its size has increased. So it can hold more blood. So automatically what it will give to the heart will reduce. So under this condition now, let's say because of this dilatation, the vein can now hold 1,500 ml of blood. Automatically, what it can give to the heart is only 1,500 ml. So you can classically see that the venous return has decreased when you dilated the vein. Now, this is how you treat a patient that has myocardial infarction. If a patient has myocardial infarction, you give the patient nitroglycerin. That is what you give. A lot of people don't know how nitroglycerin work. This is how nitroglycerin work. Once you give nitroglycerin, nitroglycerin will dilate the vein. It's a vasodilator. It works more on the vein. When it dilates the vein will hold more of the blood and fail to give the blood back to the heart. It simply means that the venous return to the heart will reduce. When the venous return to the heart reduces, the heart will have less work to do. If the heart has less work to do, the oxygen demand will drop. Automatically, the angina pain goes away. Because what causes myocardial infarction is when the oxygen you require is less than what is being supplied to you. But when your work reduces, your need for oxygen will reduce. So it will balance out and you'll be fine. Now, the other thing is this. Imagine I gave a vasoconstrictor that now constricted the size of this vein to this red line. If the size of this vein is constricted from the blue is normal to what we have here in the red dotted line. Remember, the blue has the capacity of holding 1,000 mils of blood and giving 2,000 back to the heart. But because you have reduced the size now, it can no longer hold up to 1,000. It can only hold 500, meaning that it has to take the other 2,500 back to the heart. So when you dilate the vein holds more blood, the preload reduces. When you constrict the vein and the vein holds less blood, the preload increases. This you need to know, and I've been able to explain it in such a way you should relate with. Now, the second thing is your infusion. When you give infusion like normal saline and the rest, they can definitely increase the venous return because when you have more fluid in the body, of course, more fluid will definitely, when you have more fluid in the vein, rather, more fluid will definitely go back to the heart. For example, you now increase the fluid in this vein from 3,000 to 4,000. This vein can only hold 1,000 on a normal day. So even though you have increased the fluid to 4,000, it will still hold is 1,000 and the rest 3,000, it will send it to the heart. So you can see that the venous return has increased from the normal 2,000 to 3,000 when you give intravenous fluid like normal saline. So normal saline and venous contraction can definitely push up the preload, but venodilation and loss of fluid, like a patient that is dehydrated or has acute hemorrhage, those ones will reduce the preload. That is not in the book here, but you have to think it. They want you to be thinking. They want, if you understand the concept, apply it, think through it. If vasoconstriction and introduction of normal saline can increase the preload, it simply means that venodilation and fluid loss like hemorrhage or dehydration can drop the preload. Now, let us look at afterload. Afterload does not deal with the volume of fluid. It deals with pressure the heart will have to overcome in order to release that particular blood that is inside of the heart. Now, what you need to know is that the higher the afterload, the lower the stroke volume. We settled that because the heart will have to do a lot of work to push out that fluid, and vice versa. The lower the afterload, the higher the cardiac output. Now, I need you to understand this. When you see nitroglycerin works more on the veins. Preload is a function of the veins, but afterload is a function of the artery, because the aorta is the artery that the heart needs to pump its blood into. So when you talk of the afterload now, the afterload is a property of the arteries. Now, certain vasodilators, like when you talk about your hydralazine, ACEI, are more specific for the arteries. That is, they decrease more of the afterload. Find a place and write it down. Nitroglycerin is more for the veins. Now, your hydralazine is more for the arteries. Nitroprusside and the ACEI can do both arteries and veins, so they can affect both preload and afterload. Now, let me bring one concept that a lot of time you don't know why it happens, but let us look at it now for it to make sense. Have you ever asked yourself, why is it that hypertensive people have left ventricular hypertrophy? If somebody has chronic hypertension, one of the things you see if you definitely do an echo for them or you do an ECG is evidence of left ventricular hypertrophy. Why is left ventricular hypertrophy seen in a patient that has chronic hypertension? It is simple, it is explainable. Now look at the wall stress. This is what we call the wall stress. This is what we call the wall stress. The wall stress is equal to pressure all over 2 times wall thickness. 2 times wall thickness. Now, what you need to understand is this. The wall stress will need to be maintained at a normal level. If the wall stress is not maintained at a normal level, you may definitely have strain that can rupture that wall. So let us look at these two scenarios. Let us look at these two scenarios. Now, let's assume in a normal person, the wall stress is supposed to be 12. No, let's say the wall stress is supposed to be 10 in a normal person. Now, normal people, their blood pressure is about 120. Let's look at the systolic blood pressure. It's about 120. Now, if the systolic blood pressure is 120, for your wall stress to be 10, your wall thickness will have to be 6. 2 is always constant. So 2 times 6 will definitely give us 120 divided by 12. 120 divided by 12. This will definitely give us 10, which is definitely the wall stress in normal people. This is an illustration. So you can see that the wall thickness in this normal person is 6. Now, let us assume that this person became hypertensive. Now, the one in red is another scenario where the patient has developed hypertension. Now, his systolic blood pressure rose to about 180. Now, look at this. The systolic blood pressure now is 180. If the wall thickness still remains at 6, this will now be 2 times 6, which will definitely be 180 over 12. If you do the mathematics in your calculator, if you divide 180 by 12, you're going to get 15. You can see that the wall stress has gone up to 15, which is very, very bad. It's supposed to be maintained at 10. This can cause a lot of complication. Now, the question is, how do you bring back this wall stress to normal? The only way to do that is that the ventricle will have to undergo hypertrophy. Now, look at this. Let's assume now that the ventricle has compensated by undergoing hypertrophy. So you have 180 here as the blood pressure. This is chronic hypertension. It has persisted for long. So the body is compensating for it. Now, the wall thickness now move from 6 to 9. 2 is always constant. If you say 2 times 9, that will give you 18. So this will now become 180 all over 18. And that will definitely give you 10. The 10 now is normal as what you had before. So this is the concept why people with hypertension has increased ventricular thickening. They have that increased ventricular thickening or that left ventricular hypertrophy as a compensation to reduce the wall stress so that that ventricle does not rupture. You're increasing the pressure inside. You're increasing the wall stress. The only way to solve that problem is reduce the stress in that wall. Let me take you one step further. Just imagine this. Let's say this is a ventricular wall. These are two ventricular walls. You can see that they are the same size. Now, the pressure in this is, let's say, 120. The pressure in this is 180. You can stress this wall with this very high pressure that you might even be able to perforate this wall if time is not taken. So what you need to do is this wall will have to undergo some modification to handle this high pressure, which is it has to thicken up, it has to toughen up. This is what happened. Now, at this level now, it is capable of handling this high pressure. It has mobilized, it has undergone hypertrophy. No matter that this pressure is 180, it cannot handle it comfortably. That is exactly what I illustrated via this formula. It should make a lot of sense at this point. Now, if you look at the oxygen demand in the heart, the oxygen demand and the oxygen supply will have to be balanced. What you're requesting and what they are giving you should be balanced. Now, there are certain things that increases oxygen demand: contractility, afterload, heart rate, and diameter of the ventricle. All this increases oxygen demand. Think about it. When you're running, let us just use it. Let's use you as example to also look at what happened to the heart. If the heart is beating at a faster rate, the oxygen demand will increase. Just imagine you now. You're walking. If you're walking, you're breathing with your mouth closed. But imagine you started running at a very fast rate. You have to even be using your mouth to support your breathing because your oxygen need goes up. The same thing happens to the heart. Now let us move on. Now we start doing calculations. That is the next thing we'll start doing. We start looking at calculations basically. Now let's start with stroke volume. We look at ejection fraction. So let's come to the whiteboard. I do a lot of teaching at the level of the whiteboard. If you've mastered your concepts, you have little or no need for the materials. You just use it as a guide. Now, if you look at the concept of stroke volume, if you look at the concept of stroke volume, so this is stroke volume. Now, when you talk about stroke volume, we've settled it. This is the amount of blood in terms of volume that leaves the heart at every heartbeat. Now, let us look at these three scenarios. This is an empty heart. There is no heart that is empty, but this is just for illustration so that you get the picture. This heart is empty. There is no blood at all inside of it. So this is exhibit A. Now, in exhibit B, this heart has gotten blood via venous return. So blood has been returned. Let's say 1,000 mils of blood has come back to this heart. So this is 1,000 mils of blood sent to this heart at the end of diastole. So this is the preload. Now, this fluid that is in the heart at the end of diastole is what we call the preload or the end diastolic volume. It is called preload or the end diastolic volume. So this is EDV. This should make sense. It is end diastolic volume, meaning it is the volume of blood in the heart at the end of diastole. It is the total amount of blood or your total preload at the end of diastole. Now, one of the things you need to know is when the preload or the end diastolic volume increases, find a place and write it down. There will be increased stretch of the myocardial fiber. The myocardial fiber will stretch. Just look at it. Just think of the heart as a balloon or an elastic material. If you put more air in a balloon, you stretch the balloon. So if more blood is returned to the heart in terms of end diastolic volume, you stretch the cardiac sarcomas in order to accommodate that. Now, let us look at the next thing, the third exhibit. So this is exhibit B, where blood has been returned. This is exhibit C. In exhibit C, now, this patient has undergone, the heart has contracted and the heart has ejected, let's say about 300 mils, about 700 mils of blood. So what is left is 300. This is the end systolic volume. End systolic volume means the volume of blood that is left in the heart at the end of systole. Systole is cardiac contraction. Now look at the end diastolic volume here. The total amount of blood that was returned was 1,000. Now look at the end systolic volume. After systole, you now have 300 mils left. Now I'm asking you, what is the amount of blood that left this patient's heart? It is 700. How did we get 700? You look at the end diastolic volume. Total blood that was returned here was 1,000. Now, minus it from what was left after contraction, which is the end systolic volume. So 1,000 was brought. After contraction, 300 was left. It simply means that 1,000 minus 300 is 700. It simply means that 700 was what was pumped out of the heart. That is the stroke volume. That is the stroke volume. So that is why you can see the formula for stroke volume is end diastolic volume minus end systolic volume. It makes sense. There's a lot of manipulations you can do with this. If a person is having, okay, let me leave that out. I would have brought in the concept of the systolic and the diastolic failure. Let me leave that out. But if you have this basic understanding, you can play with a lot of things, a lot of concepts. You can play around this simple knowledge. When we get to systolic and diastolic heart failure, of course, we're not going to do the pathology in these sections, in this free section. But if we have gotten to that section, it will make a lot of sense that what you need to understand the pathophysiology is just this concept. It looks basic, but it is super important if you get it from the elementary level like this. Now we've settled your stroke volume in terms of the calculation. Let us move on to look at the ejection fraction. That is the next thing we're going to look at now. So we look at the EF. This is where a lot of people have a lot of issues. They struggle with ejection fraction. They struggle a whole lot with ejection fraction. Now, if we talk about ejection fraction, if we talk about ejection fraction, now what you need to understand is ejection fraction is not looking at the volume of blood that left the heart. It is looking at the percentage of the volume of blood. That is how it differs from stroke volume. Now, look at the formula for ejection fraction. I'm going to tie in a lot of things concerning ejection fraction. Ejection fraction is your stroke volume all over your end diastolic volume. Of course, your stroke volume formula is end diastolic volume from what we talked about in the last page minus end systolic volume. So we can still say this is the formula for ejection fraction. Now, see the thing I want us to know. This is what I want us to know. Somebody that has heart failure cannot have a normal stroke volume, but somebody that has heart failure can have a normal ejection fraction. This is where it gets confusing. This is where a lot of people get it mixed up. And that is my responsibility to tie in those concepts in such a way that everybody should be able to follow. So let us move on. Now, let me bring these two concepts for us to relate with. Let me bring these two concepts so that we can relate with it. Now, let us look at this. Let us look at this concept in this direction. I'm going to give you two instances. Now, let us look at the normal heart. This is the normal heart. Now, in the normal heart, the blood that comes in is 1,000 mils. The blood that comes into this heart is 1,000 mils. You can see this is 1,000 mils. At the end of the day, 300 mils, 700 mils will be pumped out of this heart. The end diastolic volume here, this is end diastolic, is 1,000. At the end of the day, 300 is left as the end systolic volume. This was the example we did before. This is in a normal heart. 300 is left. Now, what it simply means is that your stroke volume here is definitely 700. You know, now stroke volume is end diastolic volume minus end systolic volume. So 700 is definitely the stroke volume here. Now, let us assume the normal stroke volume a normal person needs to function is 600 mils. So let's assume this is 600 mils is the normal stroke volume you need to function normally. And this person's heart is producing 700, meaning this guy is super normal. His stroke volume is adequate to definitely sustain him. So he's good. But now let us look at something. Look at his ejection fraction. Ejection fraction is stroke volume all over the end diastolic volume. Stroke volume is 700. End diastolic volume is 1,000. So his ejection fraction is 0.7. 0.7 times 100 is 70%. Remember, you have to take it to percentage. Is 70%. This is definitely the ejection fraction. Now, let's assume that ejection fraction of 65 is normal. So this patient has an ejection fraction of 70, which is above 65. So this is very normal. So he has a normal stroke volume, which is 700, normal is 600, and he also has a normal ejection fraction, which is 70%, normal is 65. Now, let us look at a patient that has a diastolic type of heart failure. Look at the shape of this heart. Now, let's go to the next whiteboard and let's point out something. Now, look at this heart now. This patient is having a diastolic heart failure. Let's say chronic hypertension is causing this heart failure. In diastolic heart failure, the problem is that the ventricular cavity becomes reduced for several reasons. Now look at this ventricular cavity. This ventricular cavity size has become markedly reduced from what you have in the previous. Now the ventricular cavity size have reduced from 1000 to about 500 because you have wall thickness. The wall thickness is definitely eating up the ventricular spaces. Look at the cavity spaces now. The cavity spaces have definitely been taken out. You can classically say it has been taken out. It has been taken out completely. Now, what you need to understand is this. Let's assume the venous return in this particular heart now is 500 mils. The end diastolic volume here now, it's 500 mils. 500 mils came back to this heart because the capacity has reduced. Now, let's assume at the end, this heart was able to pump out 350 mils, 350 mils of blood. So the end diastolic volume is 500 because of the cavity size that reduced, 500. At the end of systole, what you have left was 150 mil. So end systolic volume, it's 150. Now, if you look at your stroke volume is end diastolic volume minus your end systolic volume, which will definitely be 500 minus 150, which would definitely be 350. Now, come to think about it, we settled it previously that 600 mils is what the normal stroke volume should be. So this person is in heart failure because the heart is pumping way less than what the person needs to survive. This person is having a deficit of as big as 250 mils. So this is classically heart failure. But now let us look at the ejection fraction. The ejection fraction is the stroke volume all over the end diastolic volume. Now, if we do the stroke volume, which is 350, divide by 500, which is the end diastolic volume, you can classically see that this person will have an ejection fraction of 0.7, which is equivalent to 70%. Punch it in your calculator, you see what I'm saying. Now you can classically see that this person have a normal ejection fraction. Ejection fraction is 65% and above, but this person is in heart failure because the stroke volume is reduced. This is the concept of heart failure with preserved ejection fraction. Now, the concept I'm trying to drive in is if a patient is having heart failure, the stroke volume is usually reduced. But the ejection fraction can be normal in heart failure depending on what is causing the heart failure. Just like I've explained in this case, this is a classic case of heart failure. Look at the stroke volume, 350 mils, which is way less than 600 mils that is required to sustain this person. But look at the ejection fraction. Ejection fraction is 70%, same as the normal heart we just did. So you should not be deceived. Ejection fraction can be comfortably normal even in a heart failure patient. If that is understood, we move on. Now, moving on now, we look at the cardiac output. Cardiac output has to deal with the amount of blood that is coming out of the heart in a minute. So you look at the stroke volume. What is the stroke volume? Stroke volume is, let me say, 300 mils, or stroke volume is, let's say, 200 mils multiplied by the heart rate. This heart is beating 70 times in a minute. So 70 times your stroke volume, that gives you your cardiac output. So the cardiac output looks at the total amount of blood that comes out of that heart in 1 minute. That's why the formula is stroke volume times heart rate. Now, you can also look at it using the oxygen consumption. That is the FIC principle, which is the rate of oxygen consumption all over arterial oxygen content minus venous oxygen content. Don't focus your energy on that. Now, the other thing you need to know is this. If a patient is exercising, if you're exercising, of course, your cardiac output will have to go up. But what you need to know is that the stroke volume will soon get to its maximum rate. If the stroke volume gets to the maximum rate, it cannot go beyond that. It will plateau because the heart has gotten to the maximum thing it can do. It cannot do beyond that. But the heart rate can keep going up to compensate for the increased cardiac output. As exercise is progressing, the heart rate can keep going up. Now, have you ever wondered why patients with arrhythmia can have sudden cardiac death, especially ventricular tachycardia? Now, the reason is this. Let's go back to the whiteboard. When you look at your heart rate, if you look at the function of the heart does two things. I told you that thing you call one heartbeat. In one heartbeat, there are two functions inside of it. One function is that the heart contracts, the other one is the heart relaxes. The heart must relax to get blood that it will pump out during contraction. Now, let's imagine you have 60 heartbeats in a minute. You have 60 beats in a minute. What it simply means is that in 1 second, just 1 second, your heart is contracting and also relaxing in just 1 second. Meaning in 30 seconds, in 30 milliseconds, rather, 30 milliseconds, the heart will have to relax. And in another 30 milliseconds, this is milliseconds is half of a second. 30 milliseconds is half of 1 second. So in another 30 milliseconds, the heart will have to contract. So this is how you get one heartbeat in 1 second, because in 30 milliseconds, it has relaxed and received blood. In another 30 milliseconds, it also contracted and pushed out the blood. Let's say in these 30 milliseconds, the heart received about 1,000 mils of blood in just these 30 milliseconds. It can now pump out that blood in the next 30 milliseconds. Now, let's imagine that this heart rate now moves from 120, from 60 rather to 120. It has doubled in rate. What it simply means is that this heart now will definitely have to be contracting once every 30 milliseconds. So the contraction goes to this. The contraction now goes, the heartbeat rather goes to this in 30 milliseconds. This is milliseconds. The heart will have to contract and it will have to relax. If you probe that further, it simply means the heart has 15 milliseconds to definitely relax, and it has another 15 milliseconds to definitely contract. Now, if it takes the heart 30 milliseconds to receive 1,000 mils of blood, it simply means that the heart will have to receive only 500 mils of blood in these 15 milliseconds. You see that the blood that comes to the heart has reduced. Automatically, cardiac output will drop because the heart is garbage in, garbage out. What I receive is what I will give. Now, imagine that this heart rate now moves to 150. From 120, it goes to 150. If this heart rate goes to 150, what you need to understand is this is going to drop further. You're going to have a further drop in this particular heart in terms of the venous return, because that 15 milliseconds now might even go to 8 milliseconds. So automatically you have a further drop in the blood that is coming to that heart. And if the blood drops so much, automatically cardiac output will definitely almost go in extinction. The heart rate at that point will not be able to compensate for anything again, because you definitely have the stroke volume markedly reduce. Where the heart rate is able to compensate is if the stroke volume is normal and heart rate is going up, or stroke volume is going up and heart rate is going up, cardiac output goes up. But this one, the stroke volume is dropping rapidly. Even your heart rate that is going up now will not definitely compensate anymore. Let's look at two practical examples. Now, you have stroke volume, let's say stroke volume of 100, and you definitely have a heart rate of, let's say, 60. You have a heart rate of 60. This will definitely give you about 600. No, this will give you about 6,000 cardiac output. This will give you 6,000 liters. Now, let's assume this patient is now having severe tachycardia, and this stroke volume has gone to, the stroke volume now has reduced to as low as 10. Let's say this cardiac output has gone to as much as 150. Cardiac heart rate rather has gone to 150, but the stroke volume has gone to as low as 10. If you do 150 times 10, what you have is 5,000 liters. You can classically see that though the heart rate went up, but because the stroke volume reduced markedly, because there is no time for that heart to be filling, you can see the cardiac output drops maximally. This is what kills people when they have ventricular tachycardia. They die from the fact that the heart cannot be filled anymore. Now, let us look at what they call the pulse pressure. Now, when we talk about the pulse pressure is simple. It is when you minus the systolic blood pressure from the diastolic blood pressure. That is what a pulse pressure means. You minus the systolic blood pressure from the diastolic blood pressure. For example, let's say you check your blood pressure. You know, they must always give you two components of blood pressures, basically. They have to give you two components. So they gave you two components of blood pressure, which is 120/80. Now, that 120/80, what it simply means is this. What it simply means is simple. The 120 is definitely your systolic blood pressure, and the 80 is your diastolic blood pressure. Your pulse pressure is simple. This systolic minus the diastolic. So under this condition, it will be definitely 120 minus 80, which is 40. Now, what is important for you to know is certain things can make the pulse pressure to go up. Certain things can make the pulse pressure to come down. These are the things you need to know. Now, the questions I want to ask, the first question I want to ask is this. What are those conditions that can take your pulse pressure to go up? Now, when you look at a patient that has aortic regurgitation, let's say a normal person has a blood pressure of 120/80. When we get to the regurg, I will explain this way better. I think we'll get to the regurg in the cardiophysiology. So I will leave that for the cardiophysiology. I'll tie in the concept in depth, hopefully by tomorrow. Now, this is the normal blood pressure. If a person has aortic regurgitation, the diastolic blood pressure falls. I will let you know why by tomorrow. Now, the diastolic blood pressure falls from 80 to about 50. Now, you can see the pulse pressure in this normal person is 40, but the pulse pressure in this person with aortic regurg has gone to 70. So aortic regurg is one condition that classically causes increase in pulse pressure. Now, in a patient that has, in an older man with aortic calcification, when people get old, they have what we call isolated systemic blood pressure, systolic blood pressure rather, because of the calcification that occur in their aortic valve. So in an older man, this is what will happen. His systolic blood pressure will go to 150, but his diastolic pressure will remain the same as 80. If you look at this, the pulse pressure here is also 70, which is higher than normal. But the challenge here now is that it is his systolic that went up, unlike aortic regurg, where it is the diastolic that dropped. So, in a nutshell, what you just need to know is anything that increases only systolic will definitely cause increased pulse pressure. And anything that decreases only diastolic will also cause increase in pulse pressure. High output cardiac state can cause it. Anemia can cause it. Now, on the other hand, let us look at those things that decreases pulse pressure. In aortic stenosis, you will definitely have the diastolic also going up. If the diastolic goes up too, systolic goes up, diastolic also goes up significantly. So you will definitely have a reduction in pulse pressure. In a patient with cardiogenic shock, the systolic falls. When the systolic falls, you will definitely have a decrease in pulse pressure. For example, the systolic was, let me say, 100. Systolic was 120/80 in a normal person, but in a person with shock, the systolic now came to 80, diastolic 60. 80 minus 60 is 20. The pulse pressure has dropped. Same thing as cardiac tamponade. In cardiac tamponade, there's equalization of pressure. Same thing as heart failure. Now, when you talk about the mean arterial pressure is simple. It is two-thirds of the diastolic blood pressure plus one-third of the systolic blood pressure. That is just easy. Now, let us look at the Sterling curve. This is where it gets interesting. A lot of doctors have difficulty interpreting graphs. When I go for an exam, one of the things I look at for are the graphical questions, the calculation questions. Those are what I really look at for, because those are the easiest things to do if you have the information. But if you don't have the information, you will keep skipping them. Everything has a pattern. You see, in medicine, you need to use everything you have learned and bring them together for it to make sense. For those of you who schooled in Nigeria, and where some of us schooled, I schooled in Nigeria, and that's where I schooled. So for those people who schooled in Nigeria, and I think my own university, University of Port Harcourt, you definitely you have to do your basic sciences. You have to do your basic sciences um, in your year one. You have to do your chemistry, you have to do your physics, you have to do your biology. You do all those things in your 100 level. Now, the reason why you do those things is that you will be needing those knowledge as you progress. For example, if you have the basic knowledge of physics, you will know how to interpret graphical representation, because it's in physics they taught you graphical interpretation. You will still have to apply it here. Now, if you see a graph, the first thing you need to do is this. Ask yourself what is represented on the vertical and what is represented on the horizontal. That is the first approach. And that is the most important approach. Now, let me use this graph to illustrate this. This is family expenses. This is family expenses. We're going to be abbreviating a lot. So let's say this is family expenses. Now, this is family size. So please, I'm going to abbreviate this as FX, family size. Let's say, let's use this. Let's say this is, at this point here, this is 2. Let's say this is 4. Let's say this is 6. Let's say this is 1,000. Let's say this is 2,000. Let's say this is 3,000. Let's say this is 4,000. So now the first thing you look at when you look at this graph is ask yourself what is on the vertical and what is on the horizontal. The vertical is trying to tell you that this is family expenses, the money the family spend. The horizontal is trying to tell you the size of the family. So this graph is trying to compare the family expenses to family sizes. Now, all you need to do is match the two of them. So they have given you a line. So just trace from this is family size of 2. Just trace it to the line. If I trace it to the line, this is where I intersected the line. So a family size of 2, we spend about $1,500 monthly. What of a family size of 4? We trace it to the line again. You see that a family size of 4, we spend way more than that. They spend close to $2,500 monthly. Look at a family size of 6. We also trace it to the line. A family size of 6 spend about $3,500 monthly. This is simply how to interpret this graph. So in a nutshell, you're seeing that the larger the family size, the more the family expenses. What you just needed was knowing what was represented on the horizontal and what was represented on the vertical. That is exactly what you need to do when you look at this particular graph. Now, looking at this graph, you definitely have stroke volume on the vertical. You have end diastolic volume, which is preload on the horizontal. That is the first thing you need to know. You need to understand. So they are trying to compare preload to definitely stroke volume. That is the first thing you need to understand before you start tying any form of interpretation. Now, let us go to the whiteboard and look at the parameters they have in that Sterling curve. So let me try to reproduce it and try to make it easier for everybody to follow. So let's use a blue here. Remember, this is the end diastolic volume. Same thing as your preload. End diastolic volume, which is same thing as your preload. This is your stroke volume. So stroke volume here on the vertical, we have known the two things we're comparing. And look at certain things. They gave certain lines like, let's say, okay, let's look at this. This is a red line. This is a red curve. Let's use a blue curve as normal. This is a blue curve. When they give you something to compare, they are not very wicked. They must always give you the normal. They must always give you the normal. Then you can see this is another one in green. And then there's one final one. Let's use this color. Now, see what I want us to do. Let us look at this. Let us look at the stroke volume of these 4 different curves at the same end diastolic volume. So let us assume that this is the end diastolic volume we're interested in at this point here. Let's say this is end diastolic volume of 2,000. Now we're tracing it from the same end diastolic volume. So we're definitely assuming that all of the 4 curves are having the same venous return. Like they have the same end diastolic volume for the 4 of them at the level of 2,000. Now, when we trace their stroke volume, we're tracing it from the same end diastolic volume. 2000. Now look at that. No, let's use red for the first one. If we trace it from 2000 now, look at the stroke volume of the first curve, which is the red curve. This red curve here, look at the stroke volume. We'll trace it to the vertical. This is the stroke volume here. Now let us trace the stroke volume of the green. That is the next curve from this same end diastolic volume of 2000. Look at the stroke volume. The stroke volume is a bit higher than what we have in the red curve. Remember, the blue is the normal. They must always tell you what is the normal. Now, let us trace the end diastolic volume of the blue, still from the 2000. You can see this is where the stroke volume of the blue is. Now, let us trace the end diastolic volume of the brown from the 2000. This is definitely where it is. That is the highest. Now, what you need to understand is that this graph tells you that at the same end diastolic volume, these four things have different stroke volume. Now, what are the two things that affect stroke volume? Ask yourself that. The two things that affect stroke volume is simple: contractility and your preload. And your preload is the same thing as end diastolic volume. So if the preload is constant here, what is simply affecting this stroke volume will be contractility. That is what is changing them. Because we can see that the end diastolic volume or the preload, all of them, we traced it at the same end diastolic volume, which is 2000, but we had different stroke volume. So it is the contractility here that is determining this particular stroke volume. Now, this is the normal. They told us the blue is normal. So this is the normal stroke volume that you're supposed to get for an end diastolic volume of 200. Now we see that the red and the green are below the normal stroke volume. So what can be causing them? This red can be heart failure. In heart failure, your stroke volume reduces rapidly. Remember, I told you in heart failure, stroke volume goes down, but ejection fraction can be preserved. But if it is stroke volume, it will definitely drop. So the red now is definitely your heart failure because the blood is being returned to the heart normally. Let's assume this one is systolic heart failure where the heart cannot contract. This is not diastolic. So blood is being returned to the heart normally, but the heart cannot contract. Because the heart cannot contract, the heart cannot push out the blood. There are two types of heart failure. There's the diastolic and systolic. In diastolic, that is the one we did, where the heart is not getting enough, but it can pump out. The systolic is that the heart is getting enough, but the heart is weak to pump out. That is what this patient is having. Now, the next thing is this. Because the heart cannot pump, we can give the heart something to increase the contractility, which is digoxin or dobutamine. If I give a patient that has heart failure digoxin or dobutamine, you will find out that the contractility of that heart will go up. Stroke volume will increase. Cardiac output will increase. Now, this green line, that the stroke volume has increased compared to patient with heart failure, but it is still lower than a normal person, is a heart failure patient that you have given an inotrope like digoxin or dobutamine. So this is heart failure plus inotrope. Classically. Now, when you look at this other one above, in this one above, you have at the same stroke, at the same end diastolic volume of a normal heart, you have a higher stroke volume. So it simply means that something is happening that is increasing the contractility. This person is normal, and this person have things increasing the contractility. For example, if this patient is exercising, exercise can definitely go here. If you give this person a catecholamine that is stimulating beta 1, it can still go here. That is all what this graph is trying to talk about. Whichever way they want to roll it, you can pick it out. They must always give you the normal, and the normal will then serve as a yardstick for comparison. This is the graph in a nutshell. This is the graph interpreted. Now, if that is clear, we can comfortably move on. We can comfortably move on and get to see more things. Now, when you look at this decreased contractility, yes, MI can decrease contractility, beta blocker, calcium channel blocker. Just think of anything that can decrease contractility, not just heart failure. Heart failure is the simplest example I use, but every other thing here, you know how calcium channel blocker can decrease contractility because you need calcium to contract. If you take it away, contractility goes down. Myocardial infarction, same thing, the heart does not get blood, so it's not functioning at that point. Beta blocker, the same thing. Now let's move to the last page. This is definitely where this is where we're going to come to the end. I thought I muted everybody. Where am I getting the sound from? Okay. Let me be sure. Sorry, 1 second. Let me be sure everybody has been muted. Okay. All right, that's fine. So I don't know where the sound is coming from, but yeah, people are muted. No, did I mute them? Okay, no. All right, so let's quickly move on. Um, so moving on now, let us look at the last page, and we can definitely call it a day for today's section. Now, when you look at the resistance and pressure and flow, I don't want you to blindly cram the I don't want you to blindly cram the um, equations and the rest. You just need to know what are the things that are important. What are the things that are important? Now, I will still take you to elementary physics. Those days in elementary physics, there's what we call resistance in series and resistance in parallel. You know that when resistance are arranged in series, the overall effect is increased. When they are arranged in parallel, the overall effect is decreased, basically. Now, let's just look at a simple example to that. This is series arrangement, arrow 1 plus arrow 2 plus arrow 3. Now, let's assume each of them is 2, 2. Arrow 1 is 2, arrow 2 is 2, arrow 3 is 2. Now, you can see that if you sum all of them together, it will give you 2 plus 2 plus 2, which is equals to 6. So you can see that their total sum, when they are arranged in series, is far larger than their individual strengths. But that is going to be opposite when it's in series, when it's in parallel, rather. This is parallel connection. Arrow 1, 1 over arrow 1 plus 1 over arrow 2 plus 1 over R3. This is basically it, plus 1 over R3. Now, when you look at this, if you look at this in depth, you get to understand something. If I decide to add all those things together, this is going to be 1 over 2 plus 1 over 2 plus 1 over 2. For people who are mathematicians, you know that 1 over 2 is the same thing as 0.5. Do it in your calculator. You will see 1 over 2 is 0.5. Now, if I add 0.5 plus 0.5 plus 0.5, what will I get? I'm going to get 1.5. Do the mathematics, add up these three things, you end up with 1.5. 1.5 is way lower than 2, which is the original individual strength of each of these resistance. So when you add a resistance in series, you increase the total resistance. When you add a resistance in parallel, you decrease the total resistance. Now, why is this thing important for me in cardio? I'm not even going to apply this concept in terms of resistance. I'm going to apply it in terms of cardiomyopathy. They will keep messing your head with this thing. But if you understand it from the way I have explained it, it will be very clear. There are two types of cardiomyopathy. There's the dilated cardiomyopathy, and there's the hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. Now, the difference between these two cardiomyopathy is in terms of the ventricular cavity. In dilated cardiomyopathy, the ventricular cavity becomes dilated, the size increases more than what you have in a normal heart. Why in a hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, the size of the ventricular cavity decreases. So the cavity size decreases. This is hypertrophic. This is dilated. Now, they will keep confusing you on how the myocardial sarcoma is arranged. Think of what I just did on that particular previous whiteboard. If you arrange resistance in series, it increases the total capacity or the total resistance strength. The same thing, if you arrange myocardial fibers or the sarcoma in series, you're going to have increase in the cavity size. This is why your dilated cardiomyopathy cardiac fibers are arranged in series. You don't need to cram it, but it's a concept that if you go through your UWorld and MBME, it's tested over and over. You just need to know that anything in series increases. That is why dilated will have to be arranged in series because it will have to increase the ventricular cavity size. On the other hand, when you look at arrangement in parallel, it decreases. That is why in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, the sarcomas will have to be arranged in parallel because the ventricular cavity size reduces. This is where that concept is applicable. Now, let us look at three different vessels. We look at the arteries, we look at the veins, we look at the capillaries. Now, what I want you to know is that the arteries are resistant vessels. That is what the arteries are. They are resistant vessels. Now, what do we mean by resistant vessels? You see, your blood pressure is controlled by your artery, basically. They are the ones responsible for controlling your blood pressure. That is why they are resistant vessels. Now, the veins are capacitant vessels. The veins are the ones that determine the amount of blood you even have in your circulation. Because if the vein decides to hold more blood, only a few will get to the heart, only a few will go to the artery. If the vein decides to release more blood, more can go to the heart, then more can definitely flow through the body. Well, now the capillary has a very important function, which you have to know. In the capillary, that is where you have the slowest amount of blood flow. The capillary has the largest surface area, but the capillary has the slowest blood flow. The question is why? These are the whys the literature will not tell you. They assume you need to know. Now, these books are mainly for medical students. That is the truth. Most of the literatures you use are meant for medical students. The USMLE exam you're writing, because you are an IMG, your exam is not different from what the US medical students are writing. That is not true. The same exam you're writing, the same exam is what the American the medical student is writing. The same question, nothing is changed. That is the reason why if you have passed those exams, you're as good as somebody who schooled in America. That is why when you start residency in a hospital and in that hospital you have people that schooled in America doing residency with you, they pay all of you the same amount. They don't discriminate because you have certified it that you have definitely qualified for it. Now, most of this literature are definitely summarized literature that your teachers are supposed to definitely tell you the important things and expatiate on it. Now, look at how this thing works. This is the arteries. The arteries will definitely come down to a point where they will reduce and get to the arterioles. They will get to the point where they get to the arterioles. They will reduce and they will get to the arterioles. Arterioles are smaller vessels. Now, these arterioles will then culminate into capillaries. These black are the capillaries. Capillaries has a very wide surface area. So you can see that they have culminated into the capillaries. Please, just 1 second. 1 second. So sorry about that. I quickly needed to control something. All right. So if you look at the capillaries, this is how the capillaries are basically. So you can classically see that the capillaries have a wider surface area. Now, these capillaries will now culminate into the venous, which in turn will enter and become the veins. So this is how the blood flows, basically. The blood comes from here. It will flow in the artery, flow in the arterioles, and then it is going to get into the capillaries. Now, the question I want to ask you is, what is the function of the capillaries? If you understand the function of the capillaries, you will now understand why the flow will have to be the slowest in the capillaries. The capillaries is where you have exchange of materials. For example, you will need oxygen to leave this blood into the tissue. Let's assume this is the liver, for example. Let's assume this thing is happening at the level of the liver. So this structure is the liver. Now, this artery is bringing oxygenated blood and blood with nutrients to this liver. Now, when it gets to this liver, it's pushed the blood into the capillaries. At the level of these capillaries, oxygen will have to leave and go to the liver cells. Why carbon dioxide that has been produced from the liver cell, we have to diffuse into the capillary. Nutrients will also leave and go to the liver. Waste will go to the blood. And their target now is that they will now go back to the vein. So an exchange has happened. Now think about it. If this blood flows with a speed of light through the capillary fast, you will not have time for those exchanges to occur. That is why the blood has to flow very slowly. As it's flowing slowly, it is giving time for exchange to happen. That is why the flow through the capillaries are usually the slowest. It has the lowest flow velocity. Viscosity is just talking about how thick the blood is, basically. Now look at this second curve. When you look at this second curve, if you have understood what I have drawn in that first board, you will still be able to play around this. I'm not going to my whiteboard again. This one, you can definitely visualize it based on what I have said. Now, my own is just to interpret these things for you again. You will need to interplay all the knowledges you have. They are definitely going to be helpful. Now, if you look at this particular diagram, you're talking about cardiac output on one side, you're talking about venous return. Now, they gave you what it means. Look at it. They told you that the red line is cardiac output. The blue is venous return. What it means is that these red lines here are definitely cardiac output. This blue one here is the venous return. Now, what you need to know is that there's only one blue line, meaning there's only one venous return, meaning they're telling you that the venous return is the same for these three different parameters. This is similar to what we did in that Sterling curve. The venous return is the same for the three of them. But the problem is that the cardiac output is increased, meaning the stroke volume goes up for each of them. The stroke volume changes rather for each of them. The solid line is the normal. Now, if you look at the line, the dotted line below, this is reduced. The dotted line above is increased. So solid line is normal. Number two is reduced. Number one is increased. Now go back to that Sterling curve and look at it. It is the same thing. What it simply means is that you have the same end diastolic volume, but what is happening now is cardiac output is decreasing or cardiac output is going up. What is going to be controlling that will definitely be contractility. Because you understand that stroke volume is affected by two things. It is affected by your contractility and your preload, which is the venous return. Now, venous return is uniform, is the same. So contractility is what is affecting it in this A graph. Now, when you look at number two is similar to what we did. Heart failure, of course, we definitely cause it. Narcotics, we cause it. If you also give beta blocker, all these things inhibit contractility. Number one, if you give beta agonist, if you give the like of the digoxin, if you do exercise, all these are things that increases contractility. That can place in number one. Now, when you look at the number two is giving you two different things. They are definitely giving you preloads at different level. They are giving you preloads at different level. This is the normal venous return, the one in the solid blue line. The solid blue line you're seeing here is the normal venous return, classically. Now, it simply means that this dotted blue line below it in number 4 means the venous return is reduced. Now, this one above it simply means the venous return is increased. That is number 3. Now, we have settled this thing before. What is that thing that can make your venous return to be reduced? I settled it that when you have dilatation of the veins, when the veins dilate, of course, the veins will hold more blood. When the vein holds more blood, automatically, you will definitely have decreased venous return. Now, on the other hand, too, when you have blood loss like hemorrhage, dehydration, automatically you would also have reduction in the effective circulating volume. That will also reduce the venous return and the preload. Those are the things you can see in number 4 in B. Now, when you look at number 3, the venous return goes up. Of course, when venous return goes up, cardiac output will go up. Two of them go hand in hand. If you give a patient normal saline, we settled it. you can push up the, if you give normal saline, you can definitely push up the effective circulating volume. You will definitely have increased venous return. Cardiac output will go up. Now, if you give sympathetic agonist, what do we mean by sympathetic agonist? Sympathetic agonist causes vasoconstriction. Remember, we settled it. If you constrict the veins can no longer hold enough blood. They will have to send the blood back to the heart. So vasoconstriction increases preload. Venodilatation decreases preload. That is another thing that can cause number 3. Then arteriovenous shunt. Arteriovenous shunt is when you're moving blood directly from the artery to the vein, bypassing the capillaries. Now, when blood moves from the arteries and gets to the capillaries, some of those blood will leak out as fluid. So the blood that gets to the vein is a little bit reduced. Now, if you're moving the blood directly from the artery to the vein, it simply means there will be no blood loss or there will be no fluid loss at all. So it simply means the veins will have to hold more blood. If the veins have more blood, of course, they can shunt more to the heart. Preload definitely goes up. Now, when we look at number 5, when we look at C, rather, in C now, there's an interplay of a lot of things. In C now, they are interplaying 3 different curves for cardiac output and 3 different curves for venous return. That is what they are interplaying. If you look at the one in the middle, the 2 solid curves in the middle, this is normal venous return. This is normal cardiac output. Now, below it, number 5, is where you have decreased cardiac output and decreased venous return. Now, what can cause that? Vasopressors. Now, how will vasopressors cause this? The way vasopressors causes this is this. Vasopressor is the one that definitely causes arterial constriction. Now, when it constricts the arteries, your afterload will go up. Now, when your afterload goes up, your cardiac output will have to drop. You can classically see that the cardiac output has come down. Now, when your cardiac output comes down, automatically the amount of blood that is carried in the artery reduces. The blood that gets to the vein comes from the artery. So if the blood in the artery is reduced, automatically the blood that gets to the vein will also reduce. So the venous return too will definitely go down because the vein can only give back what it received from the arteries. That is why vasopressors can do number 5. Now, when you look at number 6 is exercise and arteriovenous shunt. The cardiac output goes up as well as the venous return. Exercise does that notoriously. When you're exercising, the venous return is going up classically because you definitely have venoconstriction, returning those blood back to the heart rapidly. You also have increased heart rate and contractility, pushing out those blood, increasing the cardiac output. So number 6 is classically exercise. These are straightforward. Now, let me tie in the last thing. Let me find the last concept and we'll move. This is not necessarily in the literature, but let's play around it. Now, let's assume this is a curve. This curve represents, let's assume this curve represents your cardiac function. This is your end systolic volume. This is the blood after systole. This is your end diastolic volume, NDV. At this point here is when diastole ended. That is why it is the end diastolic volume. Now look at the certain interplay you can have. For example, if I give a patient normal saline will increase. What will normal saline do? Okay, before we go into that, let me add something more. so that we don't get confused. This is volume. This is pressure. So the upper part of this graph, this part of this graph is talking about pressure, while this part of this graph is talking about volume. So the horizontal is talking about volume. The vertical is talking about pressure. So if I give a patient normal saline can do something like this. The black is the normal. Normal saline can do something like this. Now, what does this thing imply? It implies that normal saline increase the end diastolic volume. Remember now, if you give normal saline, you increase the effective circulating volume. Once the effective circulating volume goes up, automatically, you will definitely increase the amount of blood that is being returned to the heart. So end diastolic volume goes up classically. Now, this same thing can also be true. Okay, no, let's look at another one. Let's look at something like this. Let's look at something like this. Look at this other brand one now. Now, what does this brand one signify? This brand one is when I give something like um, nitroglycerin. Nitroglycerin is a venodilator. It dilates the vein. When nitroglycerin dilates the vein, what will happen is that the vein will hold more blood. Preload will reduce. So you find out that the end diastolic volume withdraw. You can see where it is normally here. This is the normal one in black. You can see that with normal saline infusion, it increased to this red. Now, with nitroglycerin infusion, it reduces to this one in brown. Now, what if I give this patient something like nitroglycerin? What if I give this patient nitroglycerin? No, this is nitroglycerin already, sorry. Nitroglycerin definitely causes this. What I meant to say, what if I give this patient nitroprusside, or I give this patient hydralazine, or I give this patient ACEI? Now let's look at the next whiteboard. Let me illustrate those ones so that we don't get confused. So this is normal, this is volume, this is pressure. So the solid line is definitely the normal. Now, if I give this patient something like nitroprusside or ACEI, nitroprusside and ACEI, they act both on the arteries and the vein. Now, this is what they will do. They will reduce the afterload as well as reduce the end diastolic volume. So this is how they will do. This is them reducing the end diastolic volume. Now, this is them. No, that will be too high. This is them also reducing this patient afterload. You can see that the pressure has fallen. The pressure has fallen as well as the venous return. The original pressure was here. This pressure now was here. Today, that pressure was reduced. The original end diastolic volume was here. This is not at this point to definitely tell you that end diastolic volume has also been reduced. This is what a medication that can affect both the arteries and the vein causing vasodilatation in both of them can do. So I've been able to tie in what a normal saline can do. I've been able to tie in what your normal nitroglycerin can do, what nitroprusside can do. All you just need to do is just think about it. If you think about it, you should be able to predict the exact thing it can do. If you give a patient, if you give, what are the other things you can do? Exercise can definitely increase the end diastolic volume. It can also increase the afterload to a point. So just think about the concept behind that particular thing they are asking you. Think of what it can do to the cardiac system and just apply it to the curve. Is that easy? So this is definitely where I'll be coming to the end of this particular section. So um, at this point in time, I will definitely allow your questions, your queries at this point can come in. So I'm going to unmute the mic so the queries can come in and we'll find a way to resolve them and resolve them quickly. So I'm seeing a whole lot of hands, but it's okay. We're going to sort everybody's question by God's grace. So we're going to be doing this very fast. So Dr. Chinyere, please proceed with your question. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mahdi, for this session. So when you were talking about the resistance in parallel and series, actually there are questions that do come following that. So I was hoping that you could have, thrown more light on the blood flow when they asked you like the diameter of the vessel was decreased by half or increased by half, what happens to the blood flow? That's Purcell's law. So I was thinking that you could have, thrown more light on it, on how to go about the calculation. Thank you.
All right, that's fine. Dr. DP, please proceed. Dr. DP, please proceed. But if you're not ready, Dr. Adejoke, please go on.
Thank you, Dr. Amadi. My question had to do with, there was a place you were talking about, I think when we were looking at the page 291 on the first aid, you were describing how the vasopressors work and the effect it has on the curve. I didn't quite get that. The vasopressors on the curve, the one on page 291.
Okay, that's fine.
Thank you.
Dr. Adejoke, please proceed. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon and thank you, doctor. Please, I just need more clarification or more explanation on the ejection fraction. I didn't quite get that way when you were talking about it. Thank you.
You're welcome. Dr. Babatunde Akande, please proceed.
Thank you, Dr. Amadi. Yeah, please, as regards the arrangement of sarcomeres, when you're talking about the resistance and the likes, can you explain how you said they are arranged as regards dilated cardiomyopathy and hypertrophic cardiomyopathy?
Okay, that's fine. So, Dr. Gabriel Peter, please, can you mute your mic for me? Thank you. Dr. GHH, please, for the next meetings, please join the next meeting with your full name or at least one of your names. The system will be programmed in such a way that if you join with an abbreviation, you may not be let in. So, Dr. GHH, please, your name and then your question. Thank you.
Where is he?
We can't hear you, please. What's your name and your question? Thank you.
Where is this
All right,
man?
so I don't think I can hear her. You can drop your question on the chat box. and we will be able to look at it.
The dish. Did it time?
I can't hear you. Please drop your question on the chat box, and we'll look at it. Thank you. All right, so let's get to resolve the ones we already have. Dr. Cherry, I personally left that those things because it is not something that is important. In this pathway, there's a lot of things you have to know. I personally picked out the things I felt were important in that particular page, and I left those other ones. Yeah, I know the questions you say you've seen is a U-word question. Go back to your MBME. There's MBME 25 to MBME 31. Those are the valid MBMEs. Go and look at MBME 25 to 31. You don't see any of those concepts tested in cardiology. It is not every of the U-word concept that is an important or high yield concept. One of the things you need to know for this exam is that the MBMEs are the chiefs of the chief. Whatever they decide is final. Like MBME is the Supreme Court in this journey. What they say is final. So don't spend energy doing the things that are of low yield. It will not pay very well. So I will not go into that Poisson laws. I will not go into calculation of those diameters. Those are things I can do very comfortably. But I think it's a concept that is low yield and it's not very important. So I don't even bother teaching it. So thank you. Now, if I look at the next CV, which is the concept of the vasopressor. Now, vasopressors are medication that causes arterial constriction. Now, come to think about it, the afterload you're looking at is a function of the arteries from what we said. If I constrict my arteries, what do you think will happen? What will happen is simple. My afterload will go up. Now, when my afterload goes up, what it simply means is this. My cardiac output will drop. Remember what we said. They are opposite to one another. They are opposite to one another. Once your afterload goes up, your cardiac output drops. They are inversely proportional. That is why you see that red line definitely going down. The red line means cardiac output. On the other hand, if your cardiac output reduces, it simply means that there is less blood in that vessels, in the arteries, because the arteries is narrow. The artery is constricted. So they cannot even receive a lot of blood from the heart. That is why their pressure is high. Now, if the artery did not receive a lot of blood, come to think about it now, they will not have enough to give to the veins. It is what the heart receives. It is what the arteries receive, rather, from the heart that we move to the vein, because it's a system that is connected. The vein sends to the heart sends to the artery sends back to the vein. So if the artery did not receive enough, of course, it does not have enough to give to the vein. So the venous return will also drop because little blood was sent to the vein. That is why the blue line also reduces. Now, when you look at the concept of ejection fraction is looking at the percentage of blood that goes to the heart that was pumped out. It is not necessarily looking at the volume. I use two examples. A person that has a normal cardiac function that received 1,000 mils of blood as end diastolic volume, and the person pumped out 700 as systolic volume. Now, what the ejection fraction is looking at is what percentage of that end diastolic volume was pumped out. 700 mils was pumped out. If I want to look at it in terms of percentage, it will be 700 over 1,000, the total blood that was in the heart before contraction. If you do that mathematics, it will be 70%. So in terms of fraction, 70% of what the heart received was able to be sent out. So the contractility of that heart is normal. On the other hand, if I get to look at another heart again that is having hypertrophy or hypertensive heart failure. Now, in this other heart, the ventricular cavity size has reduced to 500. The total mils or the total blood that was returned back to the heart was 500 mil, but 350 mils left that heart. 350 mils is way lower than 700 mils in the normal heart. But now, if you look at the percentage or the fraction of the blood that left that heart, which is 350 over 500, it will still give you 70%. So ejection fraction, it's ejection fraction is you looking at the percentage of blood that left the heart compared to what was returned. While your stroke volume is you looking at the volume of blood that left the heart in every heartbeat. When you look at the sarcomas and their relationship with dilated and hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, if you put resistance in series, you see that their total effect goes up more than their individual strength. When you put them in parallel, the total strength goes lower than the individual strength. If you look at dilated and hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, if you look at the ventricular cavity size, in dilated cardiomyopathy, the ventricular cavity size is larger than in normal people. So for that ventricular cavity size to be larger, it simply means that the sarcoma will have to be arranged in series, because series is what increases the total outcome. When you look at your hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, the ventricular cavity size is reduced compared to normal. So that is definitely going to tell you that that patient's problem is due to the fact the sarcomas were arranged in parallel. That is why the ventricular cavity size is becoming lower than what you see in a normal person. So this is me sorting out all the questions. So I think our time is fast spent, but just stay for a few more minutes